So next I'd like to invite Aaron Hughes up. We're extremely honored to have him join us here this afternoon. So it's really great to see him, and he's going to tell us about some BGP best path selection. To make these higher, hold on.
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Aaron Hughes, and yes, I'm very thankful to be here. Cheers. Thanks, it's always an honor to speak at NANOG, and really appreciate being here to talk about path selection and validation. So I'm Aaron Hughes, I'm the CEO of 6Connect, but I'm also on a lot of internet-related organization boards and participate in a lot of community service. So it leaves me with a unique position to travel a lot. It means I get to go to a lot of industry-related operator forums, a bunch of RIR meetings, standards bodies, IETFs, et cetera. So I had the honor of watching and it's really fantastic to be following this last presentation, the honor of watching a live demo at IETF of a BGP implementation that included validation, which had RPKI and BGP-SEC and path validation implemented. I thought the presentation was fantastic. It was great to see a real implementation. And then I started asking some questions. And I didn't like the answers to the questions, so I decided to write this presentation and get a sense of how people really feel about the various implementations that are happening of some flavor of validation. So first I'd like to ask, how many operators are there in this room? Excellent, that's what I would expect. How many people think they implement some flavor of validation today? Haha. Also what I would expect, so that's great. So let me widen the umbrella of what is validation, because we have some really odd examples of what we call validation today. I think most of us think of it, and the reason that there were so few hands raised, most of us think of validation today as RPKI or ROA validation or BGP-SEC and path validation. But really what validation to us, and it has been for many years, is something like IRR toolkits, RIR data, AS-set validation, some flavor of LOAs, whether we're doing that with our Salesforce automation system or we're teaching our sales associates to request from our prospects a letter or some form of attestation that says, I have these prefixes and I'd like you to announce them either on my behalf or via BGP, allow them through. We have this lovely validation, which is, hey, I know you, we peer, we have a trust level, so you'll just accept all of the stuff that I send your direction, and it's enough of a trust level that we expect you're doing some flavor of taking care of your own mess. So, I think we've all come to accept a certain level of validation, and that includes that if we're seeing a mess from another network, I can call you or send you a text or get you on IRC and say, hey, clean up that mess and it'll go away. So this is what we have today. There's some great little toolkits out there like BGPQ3 and IRRPT, but is it enough? I don't know. Every conference I go to, everywhere globally, there's always a security conversation somewhere that says, hey guys, I'm still hammering the exact same nail. Please, please, please implement filtering, implement BCP 38, some kind of anti-spoofing, and we barely do that. I think the closest that we've come globally that's somewhat of a standard is we are at least filtering what we see from customers, sort of. There's very few people out there that are actually filtering upstream to say, don't send any packets out that come from prefixes not from my network, which is unfortunate, but it's our reality. We rarely ever discuss what validation should be. We just see a lot of presentations on what it could be, like, hey, everybody needs to do something, right? Whether that's some kind of RPKI ROA certificate-based system to validate things, whether the next BGP version comes out and it's magically secure. But we never really discuss how we want this to look in the future. I mean, outside of IETFs where things are being worked on, and somehow we came to this place where now there are options, but the implementation is pretty small. I have seen a very few, but a couple of implementations where we have systems for determining whether a prefix is valid, invalid, or unknown. And it's great that we have a couple out there, but still very few. So, at least it's clear that validation is still a big problem, right? We don't exactly know what it is, but just that it's a problem. Nobody's really doing anything about it. So, the good news for validation, at least in my opinion, is that now I've actually seen with my own eyes the attributes on BGP prefixes for validation, like in a little array of V's, which was really cool to see. So somebody's actually doing something about it. There are vendors that are starting to implement flavors of validation. And in theory, if we come to a place that we can convince all the majority of the operators that this is the way we want validation to look, we should see through normal upgrade process, whether that's forklift upgrade for hardware or software upgrades, that this will just come along naturally. Someday you'll just buy some gear where you've got a knob to turn on that says, I want to validate in some form, whatever form that exists, implementation of validation. And, for the first time in a very long time, we're looking at the BGP path selection process and potentially making changes to it, such as if I get a validated prefix of the same size, of an equal size prefix has no validation, the validated prefix is going to win, which is great. I mean, it's been the same exact decision selection process for as far as I can remember. So, in theory, the future of validation, right? We're going to have a new level of judgment. Validation attributes should be looked at prior to anything else for selection. And I don't know if that's good or bad, but it kind of scared me the first time I looked at this and thought, if validation isn't implemented the way we see it today, is this ever going to get implemented? Because it's so powerful in our selection tree that it could cause some serious problems. Or you could look at this as it's so powerful in our selection tree that if we do this right, it could make the internet really clean. I love Jeff Houston shaking his head. In theory, right, battling hijacking and errors becomes a lot easier, right? In theory, participation protects your prefixes at a far broader reach, right? If you're using validation and in theory it's turned on everywhere, if you validate a prefix, the reach is to everybody that has validation enabled. It's not just protecting your own network, like filtering would be, for example. So a little bit of detail, because I just saw this for the first time in South Korea while I was at IETF in a live demo. So I'll just describe it just because I assume not a lot of people have seen this. There's a new couple of attributes on each prefix that looks like an array of V's, effectively V in an array, and right now it's two V's, V comma V. I either have BGP second path validation and or prefix validation, that is a validation of prefix to AS set. Oh, water down. Pardon me. The idea being that if you have both validations, it's really good. If you have one validation, it's good. And if you have no validations, it's just as it was before. So the more validation attributes, the higher in the path selection tree. That's how this works. Okay, so the bad news, or maybe, as I'm trying to call it here, an opportunity to fix some things if we so choose to have this dialogue. One of the questions that I asked at the IETF presentation was, what happens if I inject a longer prefix, even if I've got something that's an aggregate with validation? And the answer was, the longer prefix wins. Now I thought to myself, if you get a more specific prefix injected, why would you ever want to take that path if you got validation enables? The assumption being that if you're doing some kind of validation, that you can do it for whatever you're, whatever you're handing out downstream or whatever your more specific injections that you're providing in whatever form. So this is one of the questions that's sort of for this room and for the operator community is, Do we want to continue down the path of implementing something that doesn't drop longer prefixes when we've got some flavor of validation enabled? Should we ignore them? The pro is, we don't really need to enable the concept of roughly LE24 or LE48 more specifics. The assumption here being that if we use validation and longer prefixes are still longer prefixes are still accepted as better, we have to prepare for validation all the way down to the smallest prefix that can be injected into the table for whatever reason, right? Errors, hijacks, attacks, and we have to be prepared for battle, right? And that's how we sort of act today, is if there's a problem on the internet, we just react with battling, and we hope to win as much traffic as we can. If we were to make the decision proactively to not accept more specific prefixes if we have validation, we stop having to fight this battle. It just goes away. The con, of course, being that you need to implement some level of validation on all longer allocations and assignments, right? Because, of course, this doesn't work unless we have a knob either one direction or the other. The potential con is if we do this really well, and that assumes a lot, but if we were to do this really well, the attack vector may become the validation method itself, right? Because anytime that an attack vector goes away, people tend to find a new one. Another pro is that really well-peered networks will keep bleeding traffic to a minimum. So the theory is here that wherever there is an attack, a leak, a mistake, whatever happens, as soon as they hit a well-peered network that is enabling validation as a metric, that traffic stops dead. Those injections go no further. It stops at an edge rather than spreading all over the global internet, which I think is a nice, rather optimistic view of what could be. So could we make validation easier, right? The one thing that is very clear at every meeting I've been to is that people don't implement validation because they think it's hard or isn't going to work. There's a number of reasons, right? Implementation methods for at least RPKI and ROAs or path validation or BGP-sec are currently at least considered difficult, and there are not a lot of options out there. Now, I know there's some, and we could move forward with some of them, but we're not doing it for whatever reason. So as a simple example, could we make path validation easier? Could we make BGP-sec something as simple as a self-signed path validation, and that's it? Like, do one thing and one thing well. Could we make RPKI easier? I'm not sure, but maybe. I do know that, at least I hear from a lot of people that few networks don't want to depend on an external calculation for valid, invalid unknowns. I also hear from supporters out there that are using it that they love the idea. They think that it works really well. If we do it right, this could actually work. So in considering this, I thought, well, what if we could create one more level of validation? What if we could do something really simple, perhaps a little crazy, but do something like what we do for POC validation. Something like a link or a database or some kind of annual validation that says, hi, I still exist as a known contact for these prefixes. I'm valid enough that you know that you can still contact me for this set, and expand the idea of validation from not just path validation and prefix to AS set validation, but just a third sort of simple level layer of, hi, I'm network contact at domain, and I have these prefixes. So the pro is it's dead simple, right? Some kind of like, hey, I'm still here. The implementation level is, I got an email and I clicked a link. And, of course, it implements all those lovely features of validation, which are really nice for the internet. And it's a carrot to keep some basic contact information accurate. This is one of the things I hear in the RIR community a lot is, how do we deal with the lack of a carrot for keeping validation or contact information valid in particular for V6 as we look down the long-term timeline, where we have very large amounts of space and not a lot of motivation for, say, subsequent allocations. And I thought, well, this is kind of a neat way to cover both sides of that. It's also kind of a neat idea because it's hard for miscreants to get around, right? You get this validation link just like we do every year for things like domains. And it's really, really easy. So, I mean, there's an obvious question here, like where does this live? And this was just an idea that I had. So, this could be an RIR thing or an IRR thing or some new database. But anyway, this is a concept. So this would mean that still path validation and RPKI ROA are, it's still 2 is better than 1, 1 is better than 2. Sorry, 2 is better than 1, 1 is better than none. We're just adding a third level here. 3 beats 2, 2 beats 1, 1 beats none. So that's the concept. I open it up to comments and questions.
Rüdiger for Deutsche Telekom. Aaron, did I hear you? You were saying you presented a concept.
Yes.
Well, okay. Kind of. I have really trouble to see that anybody who cares for security would accept something that is as fuzzy as the stuff you have been talking about.
Sure.
Well, okay. Yeah, I can give you one chance for kind of coming up with something specific.
Sure, of course.
You were talking about additional BGP attributes. Which number? Where is the documentation?
Well, there is none, right? I mean,
you did see it.
Say again?
There is nothing, but you did see it.
No, I saw an actual implementation of a quagga modification on a presentation done by NIST. Yeah.
It was a BGP sec implementation.
That's correct, yeah.
And that's an argument to do something else?
No.
And not analyze whether the interaction between a number of not really specified different security concepts will create larger security?
This is a question of how we want to drive validation. This is not an argument.
Okay, kind of. As you started to talk about and ask about validation, it was fine that you did not insist to actually drill down on what validation means. Things that you had as potential options and things that are taken as validation at the moment are very different. And looking at what is acceptable validation, probably essentially none of the options actually would match. Of course, because nothing else is easily available at the moment, many people say, well, okay, I adapt to what's there. But that's not a way for getting somewhere for better.
Thank you.
So Warren Kamari, Google, I think I'm going to say something similar to what Rüdiger said, but potentially somewhat clearer. Can you go back a slide? Or hopefully clearer. I like the idea with the annual POC validation thing, but then you kind of jump down to, and then there's validation, and it sounds like there's a lot of sort of validation pixies or fairies, which are going to do a lot of the magic. So I think that you've hand-waved away the hard part. Let's actually, the annual link doesn't sound like a bad idea, but there's a lot more detail still needed.
Thank you. Great feedback. Sandra.
Sandy Murphy, Parsons. You talked a lot about changes in the best path decision process. I wanted to clarify that there is no change to the BGP decision process, if that's what you meant. There was a very strong focus in the CIDR working group from the very beginning that this all had to be subject to each individual operator's local routing policy. So what you do with the valid, invalid, unknown is completely between you and your configuration line. And lots of people have given examples of, you up pref invalid and you down pref, you up pref valid and down pref invalid, or you make it 0 and 100, whatever you want to do. You use meds, who knows. So it's all a configuration. If you're talking about how do I figure out how I want to make to choose my best path, that you're your operator. You can make your own policy. But this last slide, I think maybe I had some concerns like Warren. Like, okay, so the IRR objects already have a tech content. How is this different? Could I say I am the known contact for 12/8? Who would believe me? How would I demonstrate that I had that right to actually say that? How would that knowledge get conveyed? How would it be used when somebody wanted to decide to accept a route from me for 12/8? I just have no clue what you really mean here.
So today we have almost zero validation, right? If I start announcing a prefix, generally speaking, and I'm well peered, the prefix is going to get out somewhere, right?
Well, except for the people who are doing prefix filters based on IRR data.
Completely agree with you.
Yeah.
That's not obviously done. We can obviously get prefixes that just announce from well-peered networks and they work. Mm-hmm. So the concept here is some level of validation that's better than what it is today, which is virtually no prefix filtering. Between that and something like RPKI and or BGP-SEC and path validation.
Right.
So an easy step. And you're absolutely right. This does say unknown and a bunch of question marks, right? Yeah. Where does that data live? Yeah. Today, the best that we have is RIRs. And RIRs have some contact information for prefix holders to say, you're the prefix holder.
Right.
And that could absolutely be where this lives. But I didn't want to be specific about that. Just like, what if? What if there were another level of validation that was easy to have on a regular basis? Okay. But somehow that database has to get to you, right? It can't say, hey, Sandra, you have 12/8.
Right.
So, conceptually.
Yeah. So somebody told me one time, all security people want to have perfect security. Well, that would be great, but having security that isn't just trivially able to be circumvented is a good thing. Without some validation of some way of knowing that you have some trust in such information, it's not much help.
Wholeheartedly agree.
Doug Montgomery Nest, so sort of following up on what Sandy said, right? So all the technologies so far leave what you do with these validation markings up to local policy. If you look back to June's NANOG when we did a track with at least 3 commercial vendors that talked about their implementations, certainly one of the things you can do are ignore invalids, which eliminates sub-prefix hijacks, assuming you've created sane ROAs. Our implementation and the commercial ones probably leave you enough rope that you could implement silly policies, but they actually provide you enough tools that you can implement sane and useful policies. So
yep.
You could work your way around that.
Next.
Just 1 second.
Sure.
Just folks, I'm going to close the microphones. We have 4 more questions. I don't want to run too far over since we're already a little bit tight. So after you 4, let's keep the microphones closed. Thanks.
Cheers. And I think PTAC here next.
Yeah, I was just going to check on the claim that longer prefixes will always win in spite of the validation piece. That is actually up to your local policy on there. So while I agree the notion of having something just win out of the blue would be bad, that's actually not the case, and wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'd love to see a knob like that whenever we go down this road of validation. It's just not clear to me that there is an intent to have a knob like that at this moment. So
I think if you ask people, the general consensus has been, if I'm saying that I validate this /16 and only the /16, the general intent is nothing more specific should be considered as valid.
Thanks.
Wes George, New Star. I think it might be useful to restate this in a slightly different way than you've done it, which is that we have some we have some existing databases today that we could do validation on, like the RADB or other IRR databases, but they are, there is not really a good mechanism to trust the data that's in there. There's not quite enough level of validation that the person making the updates to RADB, for example, is actually authorized to make those updates, and there's some missing control surfaces and things like that. And so one of the things that has come up that is very related to the idea you're proposing and maybe a little less fuzzy is, right, so most of the rest of the RIRs already have a captive routing database that you can do things against. Aaron should probably just take over RADB so that we can make that the same way. And then we're at least on equal footing, and we can work on cleaning up the garbage that's in there and using the fact that there is some sort of a tie between the RIR and the database to do some of the things that right now are basically in the question mark, question mark, question mark profit state. Yep. On your slide deck. So, we've talked about this before, and you're right, there's definitely something there, but, and I don't know that it necessarily has to coexist with BGP-SEC or anything else. Like, this might be one of those things where this is, if we can get to this in reasonable time and use the tools that we have available today, RPSL tool set and things like that, great. If at some point in the future BGP-SEC and everything else ends up coming along and adding to it, there's nothing saying that we have to necessarily plan to have both of those things coexist.
Yeah, that's actually one thing I hadn't considered, is that it didn't need to coexist, but it's a really good point.
Hi, Aaron. First, thank you for the compliments of the presentation we gave at last IATF. I think I have to clarify a couple of things. The number of V's or N's or question marks or something like this, what you might have seen there, is absolute implementation dependent. So that was our choosing of displaying things, mainly for debugging purpose, but then we thought it's actually nice information and has no grounds on RFCs. So, said that, and BERT works a little bit different than the Quagga implementation. So in Quagga we were thinking, what would people like to do? What knobs and switch would they have to like? So we said, okay, we could have one thing where you configure it as, I prefer a valid RPKI validation, and I drop an invalid BGP-SEC path validation. What would take care of the longer prefix issue, because this one would be invalid and the whole thing would be invalid.
Yep.
Then we thought, maybe this is a little bit hard. Maybe you want to change your local pref. So depending on which validation gives you what result, you can up pref, down pref, you can additive, subtractive, you can change a lot of things. And I think we have a couple of other knobs as well. And I have many ideas about many other knobs, but I don't have time to implement them. Because we also use this tool for our own research and ideas. What is it we want to really see? And I cannot promise what we will add or what we don't add, what we extend or don't extend. But the implementations were more a proof of concept. Okay, BGP-SEC works, RPKI validation works. You can combine them in different ways, and that is the outcome. So for example, if you see the Quagga SRX RPKI validation reacts instantly. What other might say, hey, I don't do that. I don't query every time I want to react right away. We decided, let us do it like this. But you also could do it in a different way. You could say, hey, I connect to the RPKI validation only once a day, and then you change your validation results. So there are many ways and flavors how you can do things. So that's why I just wanted to make the notion, don't see it literally. It's one way, but there are many other ways how you can do it. And from the way of changing decision process is, if you only change the local pref, you actually don't have to change the decision process at all. In our implementations, we mangled a little bit in there because we said, okay, the MED is higher priority than whatever. We want to ignore things, but this is, again, it's a implementation dependent thing. So someone else might say, hey, that's the biggest piece of crap, I want to do it differently, and be my guest, do it. And in a way, BERT did it differently. You mentioned something else with cleaning up the data. When I heard the very first time about RPKI, I said, at this time everybody was complaining about RPSL and SWIP and how poor the data is, how old the stuff is. And at this time I was working on a project where we wanted to look into how bad is it really, and I figured out it is horribly, especially if you have to write parsers over it, because you find spelling mistakes in keywords, what I till today don't understand how this can happen if it's automated. But nevertheless, I said, hey, wait a moment, RPKIs are signed with a timestamp. They clean up the whole thing in a way. So even if you don't want to use RPKI as RPKI validation, it gives you a clean data set, because if you don't re-register your stuff, it just becomes invalid or just flies out of it. And hey, it's another piece of data, another piece of data set.
Yep. Cheers.
Rudiger for Deutsche Telekom. I'm a little bit in danger of...
Rudiger, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Unfortunately, we've actually run a little bit over, and we're already kind of over, so we got to get back on schedule. So I'm sorry to cut you off, but I'm sure we can have a lively conversation afterwards. Okay, thank you so much, Aaron.
Thanks, everybody.